Today's topic is parental consent, regulations, and strategies. My name is Bob, and I am the short order for today's presentation. I've got my contact information on the screen first while I review Lunchinar ground rules. First, all of our Lunchinar are targeted at 30 minutes. We'll probably be about 32 or 33 today. Second, we don't talk about anything state specific. We all know that every state implements school Medicaid differently. But for the Lunchinars, we try and pick topics and content that can appeal to everybody and have applicability to everybody around the country, so we don't dive down into the details of every state's rules. Third, because of the technology we use, you can all hear me, but I cannot hear you. So if you do have questions or comments, and I know a lot of you do periodically, you can drop me an email or give me a phone call after the session today. And last, for this year, we're recording the Lunchinars. So point some of your friends or coworkers towards the Lunchinar. Now, a little bit about our series. We try and give at least one topic every month. All of these topics are designed to present information in a single focused area that we think folks in school Medicaid should be aware of. Now, if you're interested in future Lunchinars, I know a lot of you are, go out to our website. You can go to the event menu, read the description of the upcoming Lunchinar, and decide whether or not you register, just like you registered for today's. Features on our website we put out last year was the ability to give us your contact information. And again, if you've done that, you never do it again. It's just a one-time thing. But anytime in the future that we schedule a Lunchinar, you'll receive an email that says, hey, there's a new Lunchinar out there. Go take a look at it. Now, we're not going to give your information away. We're not going to sell your information. Nobody from Row K is going to pick up the phone and make a sales call. We just use it to get word out about the Medicaid Lunchinars or about anything else big that might be going on in school Medicaid. So I have two learning objectives for everybody today. First, I'm going to present an overview of the consent regulations as they pertain to Medicaid billing. Now, normally when I talk about consent and it's its own full topic and I have lots of time, I also talk about consent and eligibility checking because there are a few differences that in there, a few nuanced differences. Unfortunately, today I don't have time to visit about the eligibility side of the house and consent. If you are interested in that, you can give me a phone call or an email. We can talk about it. It may be a topic that I decide to do maybe a little bit later on in the school year. The second objective for today is really to give you all some strategies that school systems have shared with me over the years that help them increase the percentage of parents who give consent. You know, a target for everybody should be 100%. And I've worked with lots of school districts who refuse to settle for getting less than 100% of parents giving them parental consent. But sometimes it doesn't work out that way, and school systems get stuck trying to figure out other ways that they can talk to parents or reach parents on the subject. So hopefully I'll give you a few strategies today, maybe some that you haven't tried yet, or maybe some you'd like to try. Now, why am I doing a consent Lunchinar? You know, the regulations for parental consent were finalized in February of 2013, 5.5 years ago. So why am I giving a consent session now? Well, I like to do this every year, and I like to do it at the beginning of the school year for one real reason, and I mentioned it already. I get more questions about parental consent than anything else all during the year. In the last few months, I've had a couple of billing companies call me, talk to me, ask me questions, ask my opinion, ask me to weigh in on different things. Last year, I was doing a workshop for all the Medicaid coordinators in the state. They brought me in. The Medicaid coordinators met for an entire day. I met with them in the afternoon, and we talked about lots of things, getting ready for audits and paperwork and operations. We also talked about consent. And about 5 minutes into the consent section, some lady raised her hand, very nice, and says, Bob, I have a question. We've been told that we have to get a new parental consent every time the services for a child change on his IEP. Well, that's 100% incorrect. Probably 10 years ago, that would have been pretty good guidance. It probably still would have been a little bit of overkill, basically doing a little bit more than they needed to. But that's not necessary today. And I asked the question, where did you get that guidance? Well, I got it from my special ed director. And a lot of people in the room kind of nodded their heads, raised their hand a lot. And it seemed like the majority of the people in the room were following that guidance. Well, that's not in accord with the final regulations that came out 5 years ago. It's not some states may, I am not aware of any, but some states might have additional requirements around consent. This state did not. So they were getting, direction that was basically outdated. So because of that, because of all the questions, I try and do a consent session early in the school year so people who are new to school Medicaid kind of talk about the top subject, learn a little bit about it. And if you do have questions, give me a call, okay? Now, let me talk about parental consent and school Medicaid billing. There are two sides of parental consent and the regulations, and I'm going to summarize those for you in just a second. The first side of the consent is the notice that the school system is required to give the parent about school Medicaid billing. The second side is the consent. The notice comes first, and it comes first in the regulations, and you'll see that in just a second. So I'm going to go through kind of the high points of what your notice to the parents must contain. Okay, so let's talk about the notification. It must describe your school Medicaid program and the fact that you need the parent's consent to send their child's information in to participate in school Medicaid billing. Okay, so your notice to the parents must say something like, and again, I'm just kind of winging something out here, paraphrasing. Hey, we participate in the school Medicaid program, parent. In order for us to participate, we may need to send information about your child to the Medicaid agency. And so we're going to need your consent to do that. So basically, just about any notice that I read around the country is worded something similarly. So you must describe in the notice that you're going to ask the parents for consent. You must tell the parents if they give you their consent, they can withdraw it at any time. And whether they grant the consent or not, or whether they grant the consent and then withdraw it sometime in the future, the school district will still provide these services to their child at no cost to the parent. So if they grant consent and the child's records are going in as part of school Medicaid, you're providing these services at no cost. If they withdraw their consent, you're still going to provide these services at no cost. And your notification to the parents must say that. Must be in the parent's native language if feasible. And I know there are lots of school districts out there that support 20, 30, 50 different languages, the native languages of the students and the families that they serve. And they do that by putting out different versions of their forms or different versions of their information on their website, on pamphlets, those sort of things. Not unusual at all. Now, this regulation says that the notification needs to be in the parent's native language if feasible, if possible. And it's really left up to the school system to make that determination. I think that, a rule of thumb that I might apply would be if I've translated my IEP forms or I've translated other parent notice kind of documents into these different languages, I would translate these into those languages too. The notification has to be an annual notification. And when the regulations came out, a guidance document came out along with it that said lots of different ways you could provide this document or this notification. You could mail it to the parents. You could hand it to the parents in a meeting. And it wouldn't have to be a special ed IEP meeting. It could be a parent-teacher conference. It could be some other kind of meeting with the parents. They also gave the guidance that you could email this to the parents if that was an acceptable form of communication in your school system. So there are lots of different ways you could give this notice to the parents, but it has to be done annually. And again, whether you do it in special ed meetings or whether you do it just at the beginning of the school year out to all parents, notification, or whether you do it in parent-teacher conferences or you send out letters or whatever it is, it has to be done annually. And it has to be understandable to the general public. I'm going to talk about this in more detail a little bit later, but this is my biggest issue with the whole parental consent area. Basically, a lot of state departments, come up with model forms that they publish, and then their school districts just take those and use them. But a lot of those forms, whether they're model forms from the state or whether a school district comes up with them by themselves, they are written very legalistic. And I don't know that they're necessarily understandable to the general public. The general public is not made up of 100% lawyers. So that's my biggest issue, but I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get down to the strategy section. So those are the high points of the notice. Now let's talk about the consent. You're required to give the parents the notice before you ask for their consent, okay? Or you ask for their consent after you provide the notice. Now, people ask me, can the notice and the consent be on the same piece of paper? Yes, they can, no doubt about it, as long as the notice comes first. Next rule is that you have to have parental consent before you submit claims for services that you provided to that student. So if you start the school year and you're providing services to a student that are reimbursable, but the parents don't give you the signed consent until, let's say, December 1st, 3 or 4 months into the school year, you cannot submit services for reimbursement until you've got that that consent on December 1st. And the Department of Education gave some verbal guidance on a conference call last year. I was not part of the conference call. It was just reported to me, basically saying if the parents, sign the form on December 1st, but the school district has been providing services since September 1st, can the school district go back and bill for November, October, September, the services before the parents signed the consent? And the verbal guidance from the Department of Ed was no, they cannot. So if the parents sign the form on December 1st, you can start submitting services for reimbursement if those services occurred on December 1st or later. It's a one-time consent. This was the big deal in 2013 when the final regulations came out. Okay. Before that, everybody was kind of going along with the guidance that, well, we need to get consent on an annual basis. 2013, the final regs came out and they said, well, you need to get consent one time. And what does that mean? That means if a student, starts in your school district when he's in first grade and the parents sign the consent form, as long as that student stays in your school district, until he graduates 12th grade, something like that, you never have to have those parents sign the consent form again. Okay, with two caveats. One, if the parents at some point in there withdraw their consent, then obviously you'd have to get them to grant another consent before you could continue billing. And a quick aside, that withdrawal, if parents give you their consent, but they later withdraw it, that withdrawal has to be in writing. So they can't just call you on the phone. They can't just see you in a parent-teacher conference or an IEP meeting or something like that and withdraw their consent. They have to do that in writing, okay? The other caveat to that is if the student leaves your school system, not just he's out sick for a couple of weeks or something like that, but actually withdraws from your school district and then re-registers and comes back. So if a student formally withdrew on a Wednesday and turned around and came right back on Thursday and re-registered and all that, got the same classes, that would be an interruption and you would need another parental consent. Now, the parental consent must be written. This is defined in the regulations as an informed consent. And one of the attributes of the word informed means that it's written. So again, parents cannot grant consent on a phone call. They cannot grant consent verbally at an IEP meeting. They have to give it to you in written form. I worked with a school district several years ago who outsourced, they're a great big huge urban district, thousands and thousands and thousands of kids. They outsourced their parental consent to a third party who, they gave them the mailing list, and then the third party would print the letters and they'd stuff the envelopes and do the postage and all that kind of stuff. But here's kind of how the letter was constructed. Basically, the letter said, hey parents, we participate in the school Medicaid program. We need your consent to use your child's records. If you don't return this letter, we're assuming you're granting us consent. Well, that letter was way out of bounds because that's an implied consent, and that does not work. You have to have a written consent, okay? All right, the consent has to say that the parents understand and agree that you're going to tap into their Medicaid benefits to pay for these services. Easy enough. And then it has to include these last three pieces. And I'll just kind of summarize that their child's personally identifiable information will be disclosed to the Medicaid agency for the purposes of participation in Medicaid billing. Has to have that information. And this is an aside from me. When I talk with school districts, when they call me and they say, we're kind of struggling getting our parental consent percentage up, this is the area where I think they really struggle. It's the presentation to the parents. This consent and the notice that we just talked about are often presented in very legalistic kind of terms. And when you think about it this way. When parents sign up for Medicaid, whether they sign up their whole family or just their kids, they know that if their child receives a medical service, that the medical provider is going to file for a Medicaid claim. That's why they're signing up for Medicare or Medicaid, right? So we in the education world are constrained a little bit. You know, if a child gets a service at a doctor's office, let's say he gets an injection from a nurse, that's a billable service, and that doctor turns around and bills Medicaid. If that child gets an injection from a school nurse as part of his IEP or a necessary service, the school district's going to bill for that reimbursement. We're constrained with the fact that the nurse's notes on that that'll be turned in for a claim are considered educational records, and that's constrained by FERPA. And that's something that I kind of skipped earlier in the presentation that I'll hit right now. The reason we have to have parental consent is because of two things. IDEIA, which was the reauthorization of the special ed law in 2004, has in it a sentence that says you must have parental consent. But even before that came out in 2004, school districts needed parental consent because of FERPA. And I'm not going to go into a great detail on FERPA here because we have a section or a Lunchinar on FERPA coming up, I think, in 2 or 3 months. But basically, FERPA covers the confidentiality of educational records and the disclosure and when you can and when you can't. Well, when a nurse in the school documents her services and the school district submits those to the Medicaid agency, that's an educational record, and that's confidentiality is covered by FERPA. That's why you have to have parental consent, and that's why I think that school districts struggle a little bit because they have to try and explain this rule, this educational release of educational records, which is kind of the same stuff that they'd have to have at a doctor's office, but kind of classified differently. Okay, so I kind of deviated there because I skipped the, something a little bit earlier, but here are the high points for the parental consent regulations. You have to give the parents a notification every year, and it has to be written, but you have a lot of different avenues and options in how you get that to the parents. The consent that the parents sign must be written, and it's a one-time consent with the caveat that I gave, the two caveats that I gave. If there's an interruption, the student leaves the district and comes back, or if the parents ever withdraw consent. Okay, those are the high points. So let me talk now about the strategies. And here's why I'm going to talk about the different strategies. A lot of school districts that I talk to say that, well, you know, we've got 63% of our parents who've granted consent, but we just can't get that other 37%. Some school districts don't, I don't want to say they don't really try, but it is a lot of work to get a higher and higher percentage. You know, a lot of school districts still do the letters thing. They send out letters and they ask the parents to sign them and return them. They might get 40% of those back, and that's where their effort may stop. And I know school districts are busy doing a million things with less dollars and less people than ever. So it's understandable that they kind of stop. Now, I have worked with enough school systems around the country to know that there are lots of school districts that are very, very active in trying to chase down parental consents. I've worked with several school districts that refuse to settle for less than 100%. And some of these strategies that I'm going to lay out for you are ones that they have given me. Okay. Now, first one is knowing the details. It's very important, in my opinion, that everybody in a school system who might talk to parents about school Medicaid billing and might have to discuss parental consent needs to know enough to answer those parents' questions. So the guidance that I give to school districts is to establish your talking points. Everybody who's going to potentially talk to parents about consent and Medicaid needs to know these 10 things or these 7 things. You need to get a consistent language around those. And then the recommendation that I give to people is have a staff professional development session for all those people where they practice saying the things out loud. You know, when you're in a position of authority and you've got some information to convey, if you sound hesitant, if you stumble, if you forget something, something like that, the person receiving that message doesn't really receive it in a real authoritative manner. And so you really need to practice saying these things out loud. Now, several years ago, I was at a conference doing an update on Medicaid, just like I'm kind of like this, not even talking about parental consent, but somebody raised their hand and said, Bob, I'm a director and I'm in a small school district. I typically sit in most of our IEP meetings, but I don't know all the rules around school Medicaid. So I usually have our lead psych talk to parents about it. And I'm not really sure that she's saying the right things. So can you help me? So what does she say? Here's what she says. Okay, parents, now we need to visit about school Medicaid. Let me tell you that the services we're going to provide your child are paid for by IDEA. That's federal dollars related to special education services. We also participate in this program called School Medicaid, which gives us federal dollars. And in my opinion, it's kind of double dipping. As a matter of fact, I'm not really sure that this is legal, but our school system participates and they want me to ask you because we need your consent to use your child's records. Now, what percentage of parents do you think sign that consent? It's almost zero in that case. And so, you know, that strategy is around everybody who might talk to parents needs to know the talking points about school Medicaid. Second strategy is to have really nice, very well written materials for parents, written for parents. I always suggest that school districts have a brochure that they can hand to parents, parents can take home. I've seen lots and lots of brochures. Typically, they're the little trifold thing. In my opinion, they describe the school Medicaid program as a program, but they don't really hit the discussion with the parents in mind. You know, they should be talking about the benefits to the kids in the school system that this program brings, the staff that we're able to enable to employ, the programs that we're able to support, the materials and the equipment that we're able to provide because of this program. I don't see a lot of that in the program brochure, nor do I see that on the school district's web pages. A lot of school districts do have a web page about school Medicaid, but again, not necessarily written for the parents' benefit. It usually describes school Medicaid. It'll say something like, such and such a school district participates in the state Medicaid program, blah, 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 you know, a paragraph, and then it says, here are the forms. And that's about it. So if you really want to get your parental consent up, you need to write these materials for parents so that parents really understand the value. Next one is a frequently asked questions document. If I walked into 100 school districts and I said, give me 5 questions that parents ask about school Medicaid, every single one of those districts would have those 5 questions out in 30 seconds or less. And my point on that is that should be your starting point, getting those questions down that parents always ask and putting down the answers that the school district is all going to talk to. Kind of goes back to that first bullet point of establishing your talking points. Having this document that's written for parents with the school district's language that you can hand to parents. It also should be the basis of the first bullet there of the talking points and your staff professional development, because everybody on your team should be able to talk to those points. Next one is the understandable notice and consent. Again, I mentioned this is my biggest problem. Whenever I talk to a school district and they say that their parental consent is low, first question I ask them is to send me your notice and your consent. And I have to say, it's not 100% of the time, but it's probably 95% of the time, those forms, the consent and the notice, are written for lawyers, by lawyers. You know, the thing I tell people is, have you ever read FERPA regulations, or have you ever read IDE regulations? Even when you know how to read those regulations, they are a tough read. Well, imagine you're a parent and somebody plops down a piece of paper and it talks about IDEA and it's got the citation numbers, you know, citation of chapter 30, section A, .2.J.3 says this. Well, if I was a parent and somebody plopped down a document like that with 15 citations in it, I would refuse to sign it until I went home and looked all that stuff up. Now, there are ways to write these documents that cover all your bases without having to write something that looks like a lawyer wrote it. Okay. Matter of fact, the regulations say it has to be understandable to the general public. And as I pointed out before, the general public is not all lawyers. So typically when I work with a school district on stuff like this, that's one of the areas of biggest concentration is writing these documents that, yes, they meet every requirement of the regulations, but they're also written for parents to really understand the program. Last one here is a state level communication. The state of Virginia, which I realize is a commonwealth, but Virginia has this letter and it's on state letterhead. And it says, "Dear parents, Virginia participates in the school Medicaid program. Here's what it does. Here's what it does for the kids in our state. Here's why we ask you for your consent." And that letter is signed by the head of the Virginia Medicaid agency, which is called DMAS in Virginia. I think that is a great tool for school districts. As a matter of fact, I always recommend to like special ed director groups or CFO office director groups. If you can get a state level application like that for parents, have it signed the agency or have it signed by the lieutenant governor or the governor or the state education, that is a great tool that your school district can use when they're the parents. All right, now I'm going to talk about strategies to use where they are actually going after class consents. You know, these school districts, 92% not happy with that. The first one, not those, it's kind of the old letters. People still send letters. Lots of people get 40% or less response from the letters, and people set for that. The one area that I think districts can really focus, increase their revenue from this program, is the parental consents. Because you get those consents up, you're already documenting everything else, you've already got the Medicaid eligibility and all that kind of stuff. If you can get those consents, if you're at 40% and you can get to 80%, your revenue is going to double. Okay, so here are some of the strategies that people have shared with me. They meet with the parents at registration time, whether it's elementary or secondary. If the parents are there and they've been in the school system for a few years and we know that we're providing services and we don't have consent, we sit down with those parents at registration time. That's a lot of work, but it's worth it for a lot of these school districts. Next one is at parent-teacher conferences, where you know, whether it's a general education teacher or a special education teacher meeting with the parents, those teachers are armed with lists of parents that the assistant principal or the special ed director or the business office director would like to talk with about parental consent and school Medicaid. And so at the end of the conference, the teacher says, "Thank you very much. If you have just a couple more minutes, Assistant Principal Bundy would like to speak with you about the school Medicaid program. He's right here." So they do that. Next one is finding the parents. And there are a couple of different ways about this. I met with one special ed director who stands outside of the buildings when it's pickup time. You know, the school buses are there and parents are there picking up their kids, and she knows which kids parents have not granted consent, and if they're being picked up, she'll stop over, introduce herself to the parents, ask if they have a minute. If they don't, she'll set an appointment for a phone call or an in-person meeting or something like that. If they do have a minute, she'll explain things to them, and she gets consents that way. And the other one is some directors that I talked to from urban large school districts who will get in their car because they're trying to get to that 100%, and they've got all these strategies in place that get them to 98%. But there's some parents who just, you know, for whatever reason, maybe it's just coincidence or timing or whatever, just don't respond with the consent. So these people will get in their cars, make an appointment to meet the parents at home after work and go and visit with them because they feel like they're the best representatives of the school district who can talk about the program and the benefits and the staff and the equipment and all the things that this school Medicaid revenue can provide. And they will take time in the evening because it's that important to them. Last one I have here is the PTA, PTO, the Parent Teacher Association at your school district, whatever it's called. Somebody shared this strategy with me, which I thought was wonderful. They met with their PTA. The board of the PTA, they explained the whole school Medicaid program to them. They explained, again, the benefits to the entire school district and the programs and the equipment and all that kind of stuff. They got the PTA to understand, the need to for parental consent and releasing the records and those kind of things, and they get the PTA's endorsement. And when they have a parent or parents who really struggle with granting consent, maybe it's because the special ed director is talking to them, or the like the business official is talking to them. They kind of feel like it's not an even discussion. But when they're talking to one of their peers, parents who also have kids who, and these parents have granted consent and they understand the program, it's a different dynamic and a different discussion. So that, I think, is a fantastic strategy, and I really like that one a lot. Now, the last slide I have here is just a couple of things to consider around parental consent. This one could probably take a whole half an hour or an hour of discussion, but I'm just going to throw these out. One of my biggest concerns with the one-time consent was that school districts might get out of practice. Their skill set at talking to parents about school Medicaid might dwindle, because it used to be they would talk to every parent every year. If that parent was having an IEP meeting with the team, they talk about school Medicaid every year because they felt like they needed a consent every year. Well, now if they get a consent, right now for a family, for a child, they never have to talk to that child's family again about consent, as long as they have that consent. So if they used to talk about it in every meeting, maybe they only have to talk about it in 2 meetings this year instead of 50 meetings or 40 meetings or something like that. And I think like it could be very easy to get out of practice. It could be very easy to kind of let that one slide. Oh, I was supposed to talk to those parents about parental consent and school Medicaid, and I forgot. I'll get them on the next meeting, or I'll get them next year. That's just one of my concerns. It's nothing that I've validated with school districts to see if their parental consent rate has actually ticked downward, but it's something that I am going to be visiting with folks about. And then the last two here are really tied together: parental consent and free care. Again, free care is probably a school Lunchinar that we'll do later in the year, but it's a program that 5 or 6 states have adopted around the country that basically allows school districts to file for Medicaid reimbursement to services they're providing to general education students. Okay. Now, again, 5 or 6 states are doing this. So here's the deal. I've got a student. He's not a special education student. He's never been receiving special education services, but he does have to go to the nurse every day to get a controlled substance for medication. He's Medicaid eligible. I'm in one of those 5 or 6 states. My school district can file for reimbursement for that service. Well, historically, the parental consent has been talked to the parents about during special education meetings, whether it's an IEP meeting or something else. This student, is not receiving special ed services, so we haven't talked to his parents in an IEP meeting. Whose responsibility is it to talk to those parents? And if you do, who's going to hold the paperwork? Because again, it used to be that the parental consent was kept in the special education department's folders in the file system. But now, if somebody else has talked to that family, we've gotten the consent, where's it going to go? And a year from now, when we're audited, the state Medicaid agency is going to say, we want to audit these 10 claims. 8 of these kids are kids who are receiving special ed services. So their paperwork more than likely is going to be in the special ed department. But 2 of these kids are gen ed kids who've been receiving medical services that we've been reimbursing them for. And where's the paperwork for those kids? That's a concern of mine. When I haven't really talked to many individual school districts. I've had meetings with like consortiums or co-ops in those kind of states, and we just talk about the fact that you're probably going to have to change your operations a little bit to support that, especially around parental consent, because things are going to change for you if you're filing for reimbursement for both gen ed kids and kids who are receiving special ed reimbursable services. Okay. That was it. I hope that was helpful. I hope that gave you all some information that maybe you didn't have before, or that maybe was new to you. But he has questions or comments, or if you want to argue with me about something about today's session, please drop me a note or give me a phone call. I'm always happy to have discussions about stuff like that. Thanks very much, everybody, for participating. We hope to see you on a future Lunchinar.